It's funny. You usually expect a certain level of comfort when you look at a map, right?
Right, absolutely.
Right.
There's that expectation of just total scientific certainty.
Yeah, exactly. Like a thick black line means a border,
Hmm.
marking where one jurisdiction ends and another one begins. And a blue squiggle is definitively a river.
It's all very organized.
Totally organized.
Yeah.
You can just point your finger at a coordinate and say, okay, there's London or there's Paris. Everything is categorized, it's labeled, and fundamentally, well, it just feels safe. The world makes sense when it's neatly drawn out on paper for you.
Well, I mean, that comfort comes from a sense of mastery, right? Mastery over the physical world. Maps give us this geographically binary framework to operate in, like the known versus the unknown.
Uh-huh.
And human beings, especially in the, Western post-Enlightenment world, we just find an immense psychological security in the known. The idea is if something is charted, it's basically conquered.
Right. But then, and this is what's so wild, you look at maps from the 19th century, specifically like maps of the African continent from the early to mid-1800s, and that comforting certainty just completely vanishes.
Oh, totally. It's this
You're not looking at neat borders and established capitals anymore. You're looking at a geographical landscape that is honestly just a massive, terrifying blank space.
Yeah, it's the absolute definition of cartographic muddy waters. Because when cartographers lack data, they don't just, leave the paper empty. Historically, that blank space becomes this canvas where imagination and projection and imperial ambition just take over.
So it's not just missing information.
Exactly. A blank space on a map isn't just missing geography. To a certain mindset, it's an invitation. It's a void that's basically demanding to be filled.
And that very concept, like the irresistible fatal draw of the blank space, is really the beating heart of our deep dive today, because we are venturing into Joseph Conrad's masterpiece, which also happens to be a massive lightning rod for controversy.
Yeah.
And that text is Heart of Darkness. Yeah, it's a heavy one.
It is. And we have this incredibly robust stack of materials in front of us to get through it. We're drawing on a detailed multi-unit study guide, and it breaks down everything. We've got Conrad's fascinating, honestly tragic biography, the historical context of 19th century European imperialism.
Which is crucial to understand.
Absolutely crucial. All the way to deep structural and modernist literary analysis. Plus, we are really going to explore the very intense, ongoing, critical debates over race and gender and empire within the text itself.
Because our goal today is really comprehensive understanding. We are going to deconstruct the mechanics of Conrad's narrative. We'll examine how he manipulates time, perception, and, well, reader expectation.
Right.
We're going to look at the brutal historical realities of the Congo Free State that actually informed this fiction. And we'll rigorously examine the arguments from major literary critics who have analyzed, praised, and, fiercely condemned this novella over the past century. Okay, so let's unpack this, because this book has a notoriously intimidating reputation. If you ask the average person what they know about Heart of Darkness, they might mumble something about, like, high school literature classes.
Or they just point to the movie Apocalypse Now.
Exactly, yeah. Francis Ford Coppola. It's seen as dense, difficult, this heavy, untouchable classic, right? But when you peel all of that academic lacquer away, you're looking at an absolutely gripping, terrifying core.
Yeah, it really is.
At its most basic level, it's a story about a man sailing a rickety patchwork steamboat up an ancient river and just completely losing his mind. And in telling that story, the author fundamentally changed how literature operates.
He really did invent a whole new way of writing.
But to understand this deeply ambiguous book, we have to start by understanding its deeply ambiguous author. Because, Joseph Conrad is actually a fake name.
Right. It's a deliberate reinvention. And grasping why he reinvented himself it's crucial to grasping the psychological depth of Heart of Darkness. You have to realize that Conrad was a man built entirely out of multiple conflicting identities.
Okay, tell us about that.
Well, he was born Joseph Theodor Conrad Nalech Korteniowski in 1857.
Wow, okay, yeah, I see why he shortened it.
Right. And crucially, he wasn't born in England, despite becoming one of the most celebrated authors in the English canon. He was born in Berdychev, which was in a region of historic Poland that had been violently annexed by Tsarist Russia during the partitions of Poland.
So right from the moment he takes his first breath, he is the subject of a massive, oppressive empire. He's born into subjugation.
He is. And his family was not, passive about that subjugation. They were deeply involved in resisting the Russian Empire. His father, Apollo Korzenowski, was a highly educated, patriotic member of the Polish landowning class, which is known as the szlachta.
So they were aristocrats, sort of.
Sort of, yes. But Apollo wasn't just a gentleman farmer. He was a poet, a translator. He translated Shakespeare and Victor Hugo, and a radical revolutionary. He actively plotted against the Russian imperialists, organizing these clandestine resistance movements.
Which I imagine carries an incredibly high price in the 1860s.
Oh, the highest price. When Conrad was just 4 years old, his father's underground political activities were discovered by the Russian authorities. The family was arrested, and then they were exiled to Vologda, which is this bleak, freezing, really remote province in northern Russia.
That sounds horrific for a 4-year-old.
The physical and psychological conditions of this exile were just brutal. The harsh climate and the despair took a rapid toll on the family's health. Conrad's mother, Ewa, contracted tuberculosis and died when Conrad was only 7 years old.
Oh, man.
Yeah. And his father, broken by the loss and his own failing health, was eventually allowed to move south, but he died when Conrad was just 11.
So he's completely orphaned by 11.
Exactly. And Apollo's funeral in Krakow was attended by thousands of people. It was this massive, silent, political demonstration against Russian rule. But right at the center of it was an 11-year-old boy who had just become an orphan of empire.
It is just a staggering amount of childhood trauma. He loses his country, his mother, and his father to the crushing weight of imperialism.
Yeah, it leaves a permanent mark.
So after that, according to our sources, he's raised by his maternal uncle, Thaddeus Bobrowski. And Uncle Thaddeus is this very practical, grounded, conservative figure, which is just a total 180-degree turn from Conrad's romantic, radical, doomed father.
Completely. Thaddeus wanted to instill discipline and practicality in the boy, basically to protect him from the romantic idealism that had killed his parents. But, you can't easily extinguish that kind of internal fire.
Right.
As Conrad entered his teenage years, the claustrophobia of his life in Eastern Europe just became unbearable. He needed an escape, and he chose the sea. He actually convinced his uncle to let him leave for France to join the French merchant marine.
And his youth in France is wildly chaotic. He doesn't just quietly learn how to tie knots or whatever. He plunges into a life of debt, gambling, and absolute danger. I mean, he becomes a gun runner.
Yes, he does. He was involved in a syndicate operating a vessel called the Tremolino. They were smuggling arms between France and Spain to support the Carlist conservative faction in the Spanish political conflicts.
That is basically an action movie.
It was a period of intense thrill-seeking, for sure, but it ended in disaster. There was a shipwreck, betrayal, and Conrad amassed massive gambling debts in Monte Carlo. The situation became so desperate that at the age of 20, feeling he had ruined all his prospects and deeply disappointed his uncle, Conrad actually shot himself in the chest.
Wait, really? A suicide attempt?
Yes, a suicide attempt that he somehow miraculously survives, and his uncle has to rush to France to cover it up, paying off his debts and framing the gunshot wound as the result of a duel just to save the family's honor.
That is unbelievable. So, with his French career in absolute ruins and still needing to make a living at sea, he pivots. He joins the British Merchant Navy.
He does.
Now, this is the pivotal moment for literature, I think, because he arrives in England in 1878 at the age of 20. And at that time, he knew perhaps a few dozen words of English.
At most, yeah.
I really need to pause on this for you listening because it's almost incomprehensible. He learns the English language starting at age 20, mostly from reading newspapers and listening to sailors on boats, and he goes on to become one of the most intricate, complex prose stylists in the entire history of English literature. The vocabulary in Heart of Darkness sends native English speakers scrambling for a dictionary today.
Oh, absolutely. It is a linguistic miracle. But it also heavily contributed to the deep sense of isolation he felt throughout his entire life. And this brings us to one of the most vital concepts in our study guide for understanding him.
The homo duplex idea.
Exactly. It's a concept that the sociologist Robert Park later formalized, but Conrad lived it perfectly. He was the ultimate homo duplex, the double man. Or, in sociological terms, a marginal man.
Okay, let's unpack homo duplex. How exactly does this dual nature manifest in him?
So, a marginal man is an individual who lives on the boundary of two or more distinct cultures, profoundly influenced by all of them, but never fully integrated or accepted into any single one.
Okay.
Think about the layers of Conrad's identity. He possessed a trilingual and tricultural existence. He was a Polish nobleman by birth, steeped in Slavic romanticism and tragedy. Then he spent his formative youth absorbing French culture and literature. And finally, he became a British citizen by naturalization, serving as a master mariner under the Red Ensign of the British Empire.
So he is basically entirely untethered. I mean, he isn't quite Polish anymore because he left and he writes in English. He isn't French. And despite commanding British ships, he certainly isn't fundamentally British.
No, not at all. And furthermore, the duality extended to his worldview. He was a highly practical, technical mariner whose life depended on strict adherence to rules, yet he was a brooding, introspective writer.
A walking cot.
Exactly. He possessed a strict moral code, yet he harbored a profound, almost nihilistic skepticism about human nature and the march of progress. This dual identity meant he experienced the world with a stereoscopic vision.
What do you mean by stereoscopic?
Well, he could see the grand, civilized facade of Victorian England, but he simultaneously understood the brutal, subjugating mechanics of empire because he had been a victim of it as a child in Poland.
I see. So he's functioning as a sort of literary chameleon. He's writing his novels in his third language, specifically targeting a British reading public that he desperately needs to buy his books so he can survive. He wants their approval. But secretly, deep down, he feels entirely alienated from their comfortable imperial worldview.
A brilliant illustration of this internal divide is found right in his personal correspondence. Conrad purposefully anglicized his name-dropping the unpronounceable Korczynski and elevating his middle names to obscure his foreignness from his English readers. He wanted to blend in.
Right. Makes sense for sales.
But then, he once wrote a deeply revealing letter to a fellow Polish exile. He stated that both at sea and on land, his point of view was definitively English, but he added a really crucial caveat. I'll quote it directly. From which the conclusion should not be drawn that I have become an Englishman. That is not the case.
Wow. So he is inside the machine, wearing the uniform, speaking the language, but he is observing it with the detached, deeply cynical eyes of an outsider. He knows the machine is built on bones.
Precisely. The concept of homo duplex perfectly explains the textural fabric of Conrad's writing. It explains why Heart of Darkness is saturated with contradictions, shifting perspectives, and layers of profound irony.
What's all starting to make sense?
He is a man caught between two worlds, which provided him with the unique, albeit painful, vantage point necessary to dismantle the grand ideological illusions of the 19th century.
And that internal friction, that psychological alienation, is what really primes him for the defining experience of his life. So we move from his personal history directly into the stark, horrifying historical reality of the 1890s. Earlier, we mentioned those blank spaces on the map of Africa. Conrad was obsessed with them.
He was. It was a very common fascination for boys of his generation, actually. Conrad himself recalled that when he was a child, he literally pointed his finger at the blank space in the center of the African map and declared, "When I grow up, I will go there."
It's that draw of the unknown.
Exactly. He was intoxicated by the narratives of exploration, the mystery of the unknown. But by the time he actually managed to get there as an adult in 1890, that map was undergoing a rapid, violent transformation.
Right.
The blank spaces were being fiercely, aggressively filled in by European powers during an era historians call the Scramble for Africa, or, as Conrad more accurately termed it, the Scramble for Loot.
And the architect of the specific horror that Conrad walked into was King Leopold II of Belgium.
Yes, and the situation in the Congo was unique and deeply insidious.
How so?
Well, unlike other colonial possessions that were claimed by sovereign nations like British India or French Indochina, the massive Congo River basin was claimed by King Leopold II as his own personal, private property.
Wait. How does one man claim a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, like just personally own it?
Through an elaborate, masterful public relations campaign. It's pretty shocking. Following the explorations of Henry Morton Stanley, Leopold formed what he called the International African Association. He pitched it to the rest of the world, particularly at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, as a purely philanthropic endeavor.
A charity, basically.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
He promised to suppress the Arab slave trade, to establish free trade for all European nations, and to execute a noble civilizing mission, bringing justice, law, Christianity, and commerce to the so-called Dark Continent.
So he sold the European public a story of pure benevolence and enlightenment.
And they bought it entirely. Leopold was granted international recognition of the Congo Free State. But the reality on the ground was the absolute antithesis of philanthropy. Leopold effectively sealed off the territory and turned it into a vast, brutal labor camp designed solely for the rapacious extraction of resources.
And initially, the primary prize there was ivory, right?
Yeah.
We need to explain why ivory was such a big deal back then. Today, we associate it mostly with poaching and conservation efforts, but in the 1890s, ivory was basically the equivalent of plastic or silicone today, wasn't it?
Exactly. Ivory was highly malleable, it was durable, and it was considered a major luxury material. It was used to manufacture piano keys, billiard balls, cutlery handles, false teeth, ornaments, you name it.
So everyone wanted it.
The European demand was insatiable. So to meet this demand, Leopold's agents instituted a quota system enforced by a private mercenary army called the Force Publique. They would enter a village, take the women and children hostage, and force the men into the jungle to hunt elephants.
And carry it all back.
Right, carry the incredibly heavy ivory tusks back to the trading stations. And if the quotas weren't met, the villages were burned, the hostages were killed, and the soldiers would sever the hands of the dead to prove to their superiors that they hadn't wasted their ammunition on hunting animals.
It is just stomach-churning. It was systemic bureaucratic terrorism. And Joseph Conrad sailed a steamboat right into the middle of it. In 1890, through his aunt's connections in Brussels, Conrad secured a job commanding a river steamer for a Belgian trading company.
The Société Anonyme Belge pour le Commerce du Congo.
Yeah, that one. He went in expecting the noble boy's adventure he had dreamed of as a child. He genuinely thought he was participating in a grand civilizing mission. And what he found shattered his worldview forever.
It did. The historical record we have of Conrad's time there provides a terrifying prelude to the novel. Our sources detail the entries from Conrad's actual Congo diary.
What does he write about?
Well, just getting to the navigable part of the Congo River required a grueling, multi-week, 250-mile overland trek through the jungle, bypassing a series of massive cataracts.
The physical toll of that trek alone must have been staggering.
It was hellish, and the psychological toll was worse. In his diary, Conrad documents the sheer, casual horror of the infrastructure Leopold had built. He describes walking along the caravan trail and passing a skeleton tied to a post.
Just tied to a post.
Yeah. He notes the graves of countless white trading agents marked only by crude heaps of stones. The landscape was literally littered with the dying victims of forced labor, discarded when they were no longer useful. It was a dismal, monotonous atmosphere of heat, disease, and death.
And he actually contracts severe dysentery and malaria while he's there, doesn't he? His physical health is breaking down at the exact same time his mental model of the world is collapsing.
Precisely. And there's a key encounter during this time. He meets a sick company agent at the interstation named Georges Antoine Klein.
Ah, Klein.
Yes. Klein is brought aboard Conrad's steamer for the return journey downriver, but he dies on the boat. And Klein, historically, becomes the foundational prototype for the infamous character of Mr. Kurtz in the novel.
What's really fascinating here is how this specific historical trauma functioned at an ideological crucible for Conrad. Because before 1890, Conrad arrived in Africa with the ideological baggage of a moderately conservative subject of the British Empire, right?
He did. He generally believed in the inherent goodness of European expansion. You know, the idea that bringing commerce to remote regions was ultimately beneficial. But the reality of the Congo utterly dismantled that belief. He saw that the grand rhetoric of civilization was merely a mask for greed, exploitation, and unimaginable violence.
And that realization is the true genesis of Heart of Darkness. The sheer scale of the horror he witnessed and his own minor complicity in it as an employee of the trading company forced him to write a story that would rip the mask off European imperialism.
It demanded to be written.
But here's the massive literary problem he faced. He couldn't just write a standard, straightforward adventure novel about this. The experience was too complex, too surreal, and honestly too horrifying to fit into the established molds of Victorian literature. He literally had to invent a new way of telling a story.
Exactly. And to understand the structural genius of the book, we have to understand the specific audience Conrad was writing for and how he intentionally manipulated them.
Right, who was he writing for?
When Conrad finally refined his Congo experiences into the novella Heart of Darkness in 1899, he serialized it in Blackwood's magazine, which is familiarly known to its loyal readers as MAGA.
Now, who is reading MAGA in 1899? Like, what's their demographic?
The readership of MAGA was the conservative heartland of the British Empire. They were military officers, colonial administrators, country squires, and their families. They were people who benefited deeply from the imperial system.
Got it.
And they had very specific expectations when they picked up a copy of the magazine. They expected traditional, action-packed boys' adventure tales. They were accustomed to the works of writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, H. Rider Haggard, or Rudyard Kipling.
Right. They wanted stories of brave, square-jawed British men venturing into the exotic wilderness, facing external dangers like pirates or hostile natives, and triumphing through physical courage and decisive moral action.
Yeah.
They wanted stories that validated their worldview.
Exactly. And Conrad completely subverts this expectation from the very first page. He pulls the rug out from under the MAGA reader with breathtaking audacity.
Oh, so.
Well, instead of a hero demonstrating mastery over his environment, the story relies on passivity, inertness, confusion, and profound psychological brooding.
There is virtually no traditional action in this entire book.
Right.
Marlowe, the protagonist, doesn't engage in swashbuckling sword fights. His grandest moments of physical action consist of taking off his blood-soaked boots, blowing a little two-penny steam whistle to scare away attackers, and heaving a dead body overboard.
Yeah, that's about it for the action.
The adventure here isn't an external conquest. It is purely an inward, terrifying descent into the human psyche.
And to achieve this subversion without immediately alienating his conservative readers, Conrad employs a highly complex narrative structure. The frame narrative.
The frame narrative. Let's dig into that.
He doesn't just start the story in the Congo. Instead, we have an unnamed frame narrator sitting on the deck of a cruising yawl called the Nelly, anchored on the River Thames in England, waiting for the tide to turn.
Okay.
This unnamed narrator is listening to another sailor, Charlie Marlowe, tell a story about his past experiences in the Congo.
So Marlowe is an Englishman, which is crucial. Marlowe acts as a mask that Conrad, the Polish outsider, wears. He uses Marlowe to speak to his English audience as a presumed insider, someone who shares their values, while maintaining this deeply ironic distance.
The layers of separation here are essential. Our sources bring up a brilliant analogy regarding Madame Tussauds wax museum to explain this narrative distance.
The wax figure painting a portrait, right?
Yes. Imagine you are standing in a gallery looking at a photograph, but it's not a photograph of a person. It's a photograph of a wax figure. And that wax figure is depicting an artist in the act of painting a portrait.
It's a frame within a frame within a frame.
Yeah.
You have the actual author, Conrad, writing an unnamed narrator who is listening to Marlowe, who is telling a story about his past self, who is listening to other people tell rumors and stories about the enigmatic Kurtz. It forces the reader to navigate through all these filters of perspective.
And the most important filter is that first unnamed frame narrator. Conrad uses him as a proxy for the typical MAGA reader.
Well, that's smart.
Right. In the opening pages, this unnamed narrator looks out over the Thames and waxes poetic about the glorious history of British exploration. He talks about the greatness floating out on the river, recalling the golden knights of empire going out bearing the sword and the torch of civilization. He is deeply, comfortably entrenched in the imperial myth.
But Marlowe, our actual storyteller, sits in the shadows on the boat, listening to this romantic nonsense and immediately undercuts it. His very first line of dialogue completely shatters the narrator's grand illusion. He looks at the Thames, the heart of the British Empire, and says, "And this also has been one of the dark places of the earth."
It is a masterful stroke. Marlowe reminds the men on the boat that long before London was the capital of a global empire, it was a savage, terrifying swamp at the edge of the world, conquered by the brutal imperialism of the Romans.
Just putting them right in their place.
Exactly. The frame narrator is intellectually inferior to Marlowe. He lacks Marlowe's dark, experiential wisdom. Conrad is essentially tricking his conservative audience. He invites them to identify with the comfortable, patriotic frame narrator, only to trap them in a structure that systematically dismantles that very worldview.
It's subversive genius. He smuggles a radical critique of empire right into the favorite magazine of the imperialists. But because the story is filtered through Marlowe's memory, the pacing of the book feels incredibly strange, almost disorienting to first-time readers. You aren't getting a clear, chronological action movie.
This brings us to the actual architecture of the novel. The disorientation is entirely intentional. This inward descent into the psyche requires a very specific psychological pacing. The listener on the Thames, and by extension, the reader holding the magazine, needs to experience the confusion, the epistemological fog, and the creeping horror of the Congo exactly as Marlowe experienced it on that steamboat.
Structurally, the book operates on a very strict three-part journey. There's the journey from Europe down the coast of Africa to the central station. Then there is the agonizing, slow journey up the river to the inner station where Kurtz is located. And finally, the rapid, haunted return to Europe.
But the way Conrad describes this journey relies on a literary technique that is absolute gold if you are analyzing this text for a paper or an exam.
Oh, yes. Let's get into the literary terms.
The critical term we must discuss here was coined by the influential literary critic Ian Watt. He called it delayed decoding. This technique is the hallmark of Conrad's specific brand of literary impressionism.
Okay, we need to break down exactly how delayed decoding functions mechanically in the text.
Sure. So, in traditional 19th century Victorian fiction, you have an omniscient narrator who understands everything and explains the action clearly to the reader as it happens. If a gun is fired, the narrator tells you a man fired a gun.
Nice and simple.
But Conrad discards this entirely. With delayed decoding, the reader is presented only with a raw, fragmented sense impression first. The narrator describes what his eyes see or his ears hear before his brain has processed it. The reader only learns the actual cause of the sensory data much later in the text, replicating the exact cognitive delay of trauma and shock.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this technique isn't just a stylistic flourish. It forces you, the reader, to be an active participant in the confusion. You have to feel the panic before you get the intellectual understanding.
Absolutely.
There are two incredible defining examples of this in the text. The first happens during the journey up the river. Marlowe is standing on the deck of his steamboat navigating a tricky channel when suddenly his African crewmen drop flat on the deck. Marlowe just stands there, totally bewildered. He looks around and notices these little sticks flying around in the air.
He literally describes them as little sticks flying about, and then he gets distracted and spends an entire paragraph complaining about a snag in the river that might damage his paddle wheel.
Yes, he's worried about the boat while these little sticks are zipping past his head. It's only pages later, after the chaos escalates, that the cognitive processing catches up with the visual data, and he suddenly realizes, arrows, by Jove, we were being shot at.
Yeah, the mechanism of delayed decoding perfectly captures how the human mind operates under sudden, extreme duress. The brain registers the visual data, the little sticks, but the contextual understanding. A lethal ambush by hidden assailants lags behind because the mind is struggling to map an unprecedented threat onto its existing reality.
And the second example is even darker, and probably the most famous use of the technique in the book. Marlowe is approaching Kurtz's ruined inner station. He is looking through his binoculars from the boat.
Right, the fence posts.
Yeah. He scans the dilapidated building and admires the fence, specifically noting these round carved balls ornamenting the tops of the fence posts. He assumes it's a decorative choice, perhaps a strange architectural detail in the middle of the jungle.
He rationalizes the visual data through the lens of civilization. Fence posts have decorative finials, therefore these must be carved wooden balls.
But then he adjusts his binoculars. He gets a clearer, closer look, and he realizes, and the reader realizes with a sickening jolt, that they aren't carved wooden balls at all. They are severed, decaying human heads facing the house, impaled on the stakes.
That is delayed decoding at its most chilling and effective. It proves that the novella isn't just concerned with what happens in the plot, but heavily invested in how the human mind attempts, and often fails, to process unimaginable realities.
It's so visceral.
Conrad doesn't allow the reader to sit back comfortably and consume the horror as entertainment. He forces you into the epistemological fog. He makes you complicit in the delayed realization of the atrocity.
And that realization of atrocity requires us to pivot into the most intense, heavily debated section of our deep dive today. Having established how the story is structurally told, we have to confront what is actually being described. We have to look at the brutal realities of colonialism depicted in the text and the fierce, polarized debates it has sparked among modern critics regarding race and empire.
This is where we encounter a profound divide in the critical reception of Heart of Darkness. It is a text that has been both championed as a profound anti-imperialist statement and vehemently condemned as a deeply racist artifact of its time.
And just a quick note for you listening, we are not taking sides here. Our goal is to impartially lay out the profound arguments presented in our source material so you can evaluate the tensions yourself.
Exactly. To fully grasp the legacy of the book, we must explore both sides rigorously.
Let's start with the most famous, devastating critique of the novel. In 1975, the titan of post-colonial literature, the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, delivered a lecture at the University of Massachusetts Amherst titled An Image of Africa. In it, Achebe famously and unapologetically called Joseph Conrad a thoroughgoing racist.
Achebe's argument fundamentally changed how Heart of Darkness is taught. His central thesis is that Conrad reduces the entire continent of Africa to a mere metaphysical backdrop.
A backdrop for European issues.
Right. In Achebe's view, Africa is stripped of its own history, culture, and humanity, serving only as a dark, primal stage upon which the European mind can descend into madness and explore its own psychological disintegration.
Achebe points out that the African characters in the text are almost entirely denied language. They don't speak, they grunt, they howl, they represent a swirling mob of primal frenzy. He argues that Conrad uses the African people merely as a contrasting foil to highlight Europe's supposed spiritual grace, even as that grace is failing.
And his conclusion is quite clear.
Yeah, Achebe states that you cannot claim a book is a great work of art if it systematically dehumanizes an entire race of people to make a philosophical point about another.
It is an incredibly powerful, necessary critique. It forces readers to acknowledge the inherent biases in the narrative structure. However, the academic conversation doesn't stop there. Our sources also highlight the perspectives of other prominent scholars and writers who read Conrad's intentions differently.
Like Ezekiel Mfili, right?
Yes. For instance, the South African writer and academic Ezekiel Mfili countered some of Achebe's absolutism.
Mfili actually praised Conrad, didn't he? He noted Conrad's competent portrayal of cultural groups outside his own, arguing that we have to look closely at the deep, biting irony Conrad employs throughout the text.
That's the key, the irony.
Mfili suggests that the grotesque depictions aren't an endorsement of racism, but rather a reflection of the distorted, nightmarish reality created by the imperialists themselves.
Mfili and other defenders of the text argue that Marlowe is an unreliable narrator, a man traumatized and infected by the racist ideology of his time, and that Conrad, the author, is holding Marlowe up for critique. If we look closely at how Conrad actually portrays the Europeans in the text, Mfili's point about irony becomes highly visible.
They don't exactly come off looking good.
Not at all. The Europeans are not depicted as heroic bearers of light. They are depicted as hollow, absurd, greedy, and relentlessly cruel.
Let's look at specific examples of that absurdity because they're everywhere in the book. Take the Danish captain, Freyslevin, the man Marlowe is sent to replace. Freyslevin is supposed to be an agent of light, progress, and commerce.
Marlowe describes him as the gentlest, quietest creature that ever walked on two legs.
Yet, how does Freyslevin die? He gets into a petty, absurd dispute with a village chief over 2 black hens. He feels he has been wronged in the bargain, so this gentle European proceeds to mercilessly beat the village chief with a stick in front of the entire village until the chief's son desperately stabs Freyslevin with a spear.
And the other Europeans just leave his body there in the jungle where the grass grows up through his ribs. It's a pathetic, humiliating end that completely exposes the violent lie of the noble cause.
Another brilliant example of this critique is the character of the company accountant, whom Marlowe meets at the outer station. Marlowe arrives at this station and is immediately confronted with a literal hell on earth. He stumbles into a grove of trees where enslaved African laborers who have been worked to the brink of death have crawled away to die of starvation and disease. It is a scene of unimaginable suffering.
And sitting right in the middle of this charnel house is the company accountant. He is dressed like a hairdresser's dummy.
In pure white, right?
Yes, he is wearing a high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca slip, and snowy trousers. He has managed to keep his clothes immaculate in the middle of a brutal jungle. And what is he doing? He is keeping his accounting books in apple pie order.
He is the embodiment of bureaucratic detachment. He actually complains to Marlowe that the groans of a dying man in his office are distracting him from his clerical work, stating that the noise makes it difficult to avoid clerical errors in his ledgers.
It's sickening.
Conrad uses the accountant to deliver an incredibly biting critique of the modern, corporate imperial machine, a system that prioritizes immaculate bookkeeping over human life, remaining entirely indifferent to the suffering it causes so long as the profit margins are recorded correctly.
The Europeans are the ones who are fundamentally hollow. They lack any moral center. Meanwhile, the African natives, while often depicted through Marlowe's biased, fearful eyes as a mob, are fundamentally victims of this sham mission. And crucially, Marlowe notes a specific quality in the Africans that the Europeans lack.
Oh, this is a great point.
On the steamboat, Marlowe has a crew of African men who are quite literally starving to death because the Europeans threw their food overboard. These men heavily outnumber the heavily armed but physically weak European pilgrims on the boat. Yet they do not attack.
Marlowe is deeply struck by this. He recognizes that the starving men possess a mysterious quality: restraint. Despite their agonizing hunger and their numerical advantage, they hold back. Restraint becomes the central moral currency of the novel. It is the one essential quality required to maintain humanity in the absence of societal laws. And it is the one quality the Europeans, driven by bottomless greed, fundamentally lack.
And there is a powerful, visceral metaphor that recurs in the text that perfectly encapsulates this guilt, complicity, and lack of moral standing. The metaphor of the shoes.
The shoes.
When Marlowe first gets the job, he literally says he had to step into the shoes of his dead predecessor, Friesleben. He is stepping into the role of the imperial agent.
And that role requires complicity and violence. Later in the journey, during the Arrow attack on the steamboat, Marlowe's African helmsman is killed by a spear. He falls at Marlowe's feet, and Marlowe's shoes rapidly fill with the dying man's warm blood.
And Marlowe's reaction is frantic. He rips the blood-soaked shoes off his feet and hurls them overboard into the river.
It is a deeply symbolic gesture. It is a desperate, entirely futile attempt to wash his hands of the imperialist guilt he has inherited. By accepting the command of the boat, he stepped into the shoes of empire, and now those shoes are soaked in blood. He realizes he cannot simply participate in the system without becoming morally contaminated by it. He throws the shoes away, but the blood is already on his hands.
All of this colonial madness, all of this bureaucratic absurdity, the greed, the blood, and the utter lack of restraint culminates in the figure of one man.
Kurtz.
He is the ultimate product of European imperialism, the man Marlowe has been slowly crawling up the river to find.
Mr. Kurtz is one of the most fascinating, terrifying creations in modern literature. He's not just a character. He is a symbol. Our sources describe him as a familiar compound ghost. Conrad built Kurtz by amalgamating traits from various historical figures of the era.
He has the relentless exploratory zeal of Henry Morton Stanley, the initial idealistic fervor of the missionary David Livingstone, the sheer unchecked megalomania of King Leopold himself, and the persuasive romantic eloquence of writers like Rudyard Kipling.
Kurtz is presented as a universal genius. He is a painter, a musician, a journalist, and intellectual. He is sent into the heart of Africa as an emissary of pity, science, and progress. The company views him as their greatest asset, a man who will bring the light of civilization to the darkest corners of the earth while simultaneously bringing in more ivory than all the other agents combined.
But instead of bringing light, Kurtz is consumed by the darkness. He represents the ultimate failure of the Enlightenment project. When removed from the external restraints of European society, away from the policemen, the butchers, and the social pressure of public opinion, Kurtz's internal moral structure completely collapses. He discovers that he has no innate restraint.
We see this collapse perfectly documented in the report he writes. Before he descends into madness, Kurtz is commissioned to write a report for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. Marlowe reads this report and describes it as beautiful, soaring, eloquent rhetoric. It's full of high-minded ideals about how the white man must appear as a benevolent deity to the natives, exercising power for their ultimate good.
It is the ultimate expression of the civilizing mission myth. But at the very end of this beautiful philanthropic essay, after Kurtz has lived in the jungle, after he has allowed himself to be worshipped as a god, after he has raided the country for ivory and adorned his station with severed heads, he scribbles a postscript across the bottom of the page.
A postscript that undercuts all the beautiful rhetoric that came before it?
Yes, he writes, "Exterminate the brutes." 4 words that completely obliterate the illusion of benevolence. The mask falls off, revealing the genocidal reality of the imperial project.
Kurtz is a classic Faustian figure. He made a deal for ultimate power and knowledge, but it cost him his soul. Marlowe describes him as having a brilliant mind, but a mad soul that knew no restraint, no faith, and no fear. He became a tyrannical warlord, ruling through terror and grotesque rituals.
And that leads to...
Wait, I have to stop you there and push back on this critical interpretation for a second. Because if Kurtz is this absolute monster, a mass murderer who puts human heads on stakes and explicitly calls for genocide, why in the world does Marlowe remain loyal to him? Why does Marlowe choose to protect Kurtz's legacy over the company managers? Isn't Marlowe just making excuses for a psychopathic killer? How can choosing Kurtz possibly be framed as a moral choice?
That tension you are highlighting is exactly the central moral crux of the entire novel, and it raises an essential question about how we define truth. Marlowe is forced into what he calls a choice of nightmares.
The choice of nightmare.
On one side, he has the company managers, the accountant, the general manager. These men are engaged in the exact same brutal extraction, the exact same destruction of human life, but they hide it behind the hypocritical language of commerce and civilization. They are small, greedy, hollow men who pretend to be good.
And on the other side is Kurtz.
Yes. On the other side is Kurtz, who has abandoned all hypocrisy. He is openly monstrous, but Marlowe chooses Kurtz because in his final moments, Kurtz achieves something the managers never will, a moment of absolute horrifying self-awareness. On his deathbed in the cabin of the steamboat, as his life is slipping away, Kurtz stares into the void. He looks back at his life, his actions, his soul, and the universe, and he cries out his final words. The horror, the horror.
The horror, the horror. It is probably the most famous dying quote in English fiction.
Marlowe interprets that cry as a supreme moral victory. Kurtz finally strips away the lies, the rhetoric, and the grand illusions. He pronounces a terrible, honest judgment upon his own soul and upon the entire enterprise of European imperialism. For Marlowe, it is better to be a monster who finally acknowledges the truth of his monstrousness than to be a hollow bureaucrat who continues to live a comfortable lie. Kurtz's cry is an affirmation of a moral universe, even if it is a dark one, because it recognizes evil as evil.
That realization that the core of the whole enterprise is just pure, unadulterated horror leaves Marlowe with a terrible psychological burden. He is the only one who truly understands what happened out there. He survives the sickness, he returns to Europe, and he brings this devastating truth back to the supposed civilized world. Which leads us to the text's deeply complex, heavily debated climax.
And we must analyze this ending through the lens of gender dynamics. Because just as we discussed the critical divide on race, there is a fierce ongoing debate regarding gender representation in Heart of Darkness. Feminist critics have rightly pointed out that the novel heavily marginalizes its female characters, using them primarily as symbolic props rather than fully realized individuals.
The critique often centers on Marlowe's own explicit statements in the text. At one point, Marlowe literally says that women live in a beautiful world of their own that is too delicate to be disturbed. He believes that if women were exposed to the ugly, brutal facts of reality, the facts that men deal with, that beautiful world would shatter, and the whole structure of society would fall apart.
Critics like Nina Pelikan-Strauss have argued forcefully that the entire epistemological structure of the novel relies on this sexism. Strauss argues that Marlowe brings the harsh truth of human nature to the men on the boat by virtue of bringing a protective falsehood to the women. To understand this dynamic, we have to look closely at the two main female figures who serve to anchor the final act of the story.
First, there is the African woman, whom Marlowe sees at the inner station just before Kurtz is taken away. She is described in incredibly vivid, powerful terms. She is draped in striped fabric, adorned in brass and glass beads. She's magnificent, wild-eyed, and deeply tragic.
She functions as a powerful symbol. She represents the fierce sorrow, the fecundity, and the dark, untamed soul of the African continent itself. She stands on the riverbank, raising her arms in despair, mourning the departure of Kurtz, whom she has seemingly been involved with. She embodies a raw, unspoken truth.
Contrast her with the final woman in the book, Kurtz's intended. His European fiancée, waiting for him back in a city that Marlowe ominously compares to a whited sepulcher, beautiful on the outside, full of dead bones on the inside. Marlowe goes to visit her more than a year after Kurtz's death to return his personal papers.
The contrast is stark. Where the African woman was vibrant and wild in the sunlight, the intended is pale, dressed entirely in black mourning clothes, living in a dark mahogany drawing room that Marlowe describes as feeling like a tomb or sarcophagus. She is completely, blindly devoted to the memory of Kurtz. She believes him to be a saint, a great apostle of light, a man of pure nobility. She has absolutely no idea who he actually became in the jungle.
And this is where the climax of the entire narrative occurs. It's an incredibly tense, suffocating scene. The intended is weeping, clinging to her idealized vision of her fiancé, and she begs Marlowe to give her one final piece of comfort. She needs the closure of knowing he died a noble man. She asks Marlowe, "Repeat them. I want something to live with." She is begging to know Kurtz's last words.
And Marlowe, who throughout the entire book has stated how much he hates, detests, and is fundamentally nauseated by lies, looks at this grieving woman and he lies to her. He cannot bring himself to tell her that Kurtz's actual last words were the horror. The horror. Instead, he tells her the last word he pronounced was your name.
It's an absolute gut punch of an ending, and it leaves us with this deliberate, agonizing ambiguity that scholars have debated for a century. Why does he lie? Does he lie because he is a misogynist, simply keeping a naive woman in the dark because he thinks her fragile female mind can't handle the truth? Is he just being patronizing?
Or does he lie for a much larger, more terrifying symbolic reason? We must remember that the intended isn't just a literal woman in a drawing room. Allegorically, she represents Europe itself. She represents the domestic public back home who benefit from the empire but refuse to look at the blood on their hands. Europe is ignorant, blindly faithful to the idea of its own benevolence, and entirely built on a dark, hollow truth.
If Marlowe tells her the truth, if he tells her that the grand champion of European ideals died screaming about the horror, he shatters the saving illusion that keeps society functioning. He realizes the truth is too dark, too corrosive for the civilized world to bear. Society needs the lie to survive. He sacrifices his own moral integrity by telling a lie to protect the fragile, hypocritical structure of civilization from collapsing under the weight of its own darkness.
It is a profoundly pessimistic conclusion. Conrad offers no easy redemption, no clear moral high ground. He leaves the reader stranded in the fog, forced to grapple with the complicity of civilization itself.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive, heavy amount of ground today. We've explored how a Polish orphan, traumatized by Russian oppression, reinvented himself as a British sailor and used that borrowed voice to expose the genocidal atrocities of King Leopold's Belgian Congo. We've seen how he had to invent modernist literary techniques like the layered frame narrative and delayed decoding to force his complacent readers to experience the cognitive shock of trauma. We've navigated the intense, valid criticisms of Achebe regarding the dehumanization of Africa, and we've wrestled with the chilling moral ambiguity of a man choosing a monster over a hypocrite, only to return home and protect the grand lie of civilization.
It is a text that fundamentally changed the trajectory of modern literature. Its DNA is everywhere. It directly inspired T.S. Eliot's landmark poem, The Wasteland. It provided the architectural framework for Francis Ford Coppola's cinematic masterpiece, Apocalypse Now. And its echoes can be found in science fiction, psychological thrillers, and post-colonial literature to this day. It is a book that relentlessly forces us to question our own assumptions about civilization, savagery, and the latent darkness that resides within the human heart when all external restraints are stripped away.
If you are taking an exam, prepping for a seminar, or writing a major paper, you are now fully armed with the structural knowledge, the historical context, and the thematic ammunition you need to dominate the material. But before we finish our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. It's drawn directly from the source material, but I want you to apply it to the world we live in right now.
A little modern context.
Exactly. Think back to the very beginning of Marlowe's journey. Before he even boards the ship for Africa, he visits the company headquarters in a European city to sign his contract. And sitting there in the gloomy outer office are two women, quietly knitting black wool. Our sources point out that Conrad is explicitly comparing these women to the Fates from classical mythology, the ancient, indifferent deities who silently weave, measure, and cut the threads of human destiny. They are the gatekeepers to the dark machine, knitting the shroud for the men who will go out and die or kill for the company.
A haunting image.
In our modern world, we may not be extracting ivory from the Congo, but we are surrounded by massive corporate machines, vast, opaque global supply chains, and visible algorithmic structures that dictate our lives. We are all, in some way, employees sailing up our own metaphorical rivers. So the question is, who or what is knitting the black wool for you today? Are you awake to the reality of the systems you are stepping into? Or are you, like Marlowe before his journey, just blindly putting on someone else's blood-soaked shoes?